Greetings, everyone, and welcome. I'm Joseph Sassoon, a professor of history and political economy at Georgetown. It is really my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Toby Dodge from London School of Economics, who is a top expert on Iraq, has written two books, um, Iraq from War to a New Authoritarianism, which was one of the Economist books of the year in 2013, and Inventing Iraq, the Failure of Nation Building and a History Denied. Um, Professor Dodge will be talking about his forthcoming book that will be out in a couple of years, based on huge number of interviews that he conducted in Baghdad. So without any further ado, Professor Dodge, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Um, and please go ahead.
Great, thank you, Joseph. It's a pleasure to be here, although not here. It's a pleasure to be virtually here, though given what I hear about the weather in Washington, which is even fouler than the weather in London, I think I'd rather be here than there, and that's saying something. Okay, I want to do a few things today, maybe three or four big things. So that's, if I've got 45 minutes, that's probably 15 minutes each theme. Firstly, I want to talk a little bit about me, a bit narcissistic, I apologize for that, but me, the academic, and how I've come and why I've come to interviewing. Then I want to talk about the book project that Joseph's mentioned and why it can't be done in any other methodological way but through semi-structured interviewing and broadly, with the exception of one chapter, semi-structured elite interviewing. So that's the first big thing. What I'm doing at the moment is elite interviewing. And I think that's not for everyone, or possibly even for the majority of PhD students, as far as I understand it, who very much like history from below, social history, history of the oppressed, and good luck to you. But the questions I have been left with about Iraq spring from the agency of elite Iraqis, and the only way I could get to that, I suspect, is through interviewing them directly. I then want to go to my own methodology. And as a kind of show and tell, I brought one of about 50 notebooks that I carry with me. I carry one or two notebooks with me, but the 50 that I built up into an archive, so we can talk about that. And then I want to finish off, and this hopefully will go into a discussion about the work of Lee and Fuji, sadly no longer with us, interviewing in the social sciences. And Joseph says that you've already sent him some questions about the book. I think it's the book I use centrally at LSE for our PhD students, but it is a tough book. And I would say diplomatically, it's an aspirational book. That basically what Leanne is setting out is a series of goals to work towards, a kind of disciplinary set of, if not demands, then aspirations that keep us honest and keep us moving towards the goals that she set us. So I very, very much like the book. I carry it with me when I go to Iraq, almost as a liturgical or religious reference, because I think it keeps us honest and self-reflective. And I think the aspirations that it sets out are a very powerful corrective. I think when you're in the field, especially as a PhD student with a comparatively limited amount of time, everything feels precious. Everything feels that it's a kind of that the stakes are very high, and what Leanne is doing in this book is saying, wait a minute, there are other people involved, and they need to be understood, given given credibility and given humanity. Now, what I'll add before I get into the meat of this is the people I interview being members of the Iraqi elite. There's two or three, the majority of whom are certainly been involved in the older ones encouraging the United States and Britain to invade Iraq. I interviewed Ahmed Chalabi once before he died. Certainly, some of them have been involved in murdering a large amount of people. And thirdly, much more on a much grander scale, quite a lot of them have been involved in grand larceny. That they've stolen a large amount of money from the Iraqi exchequer, from the Iraqi finance ministry. But that said, as Leanne Fuji would ask us, I treat them with huge amounts of respect and humanity because they are not only humans like us, deserved of respect, but they're Iraqis, and I'm clearly not. And what I'm intervening into their lives and asking them to share with me difficult, possibly embarrassing, possibly compromising subjects. And I think that should breed in me in a reflexivity and a continued humility that I think Leanne Fuji's book is very good at delivering. Now, let me start with an anecdote. Last summer, I was in a European capital, the sun was shining, and I got an email from two young PhD students who said, "We've heard you're in town. Can we meet you?" And so I met them and I said the following statement. You know, I've always found interviewing and access in Iraq really easy. The elites are very open and you can go and talk to them. And bless them, these two PhD students were absolutely incredulous and basically said, "You may say that, white old man, but that wouldn't be the same for us." And I think that's the point of Leanne Fuji's argument, that I needed to reflect on why Iraq was open to me. Certainly, at stages in the past, my life's been put in danger by going to Iraq, and I was clearly at times a a candidate for kidnapping, but also my age, my class, my gender have given me access that these two young PhD students of Iraqi descent thought they would never get. Now, one of them is living in Sadr City doing ethnographic research at the moment, which is something I couldn't do. So it cuts both ways, but that's Leanne Fuji's point about reflexivity. Also, so let me start just about me first and my research trajectory, which I think is worth thinking about. Because what I'm saying is I've come to interviewing uh, by accident, undoubtedly. So I started off as Joseph started off basically as an archival historian. And I still have a huge uh, love of the archives, and I miss them. The archives are solid. The archives that I spent almost a decade working in at the end of the District Line in London, the Public Records Office, or at the end of the Central Line in London, the India Office Library now at the British Museum, and I could go there when I wanted to for the price of a tube ticket. And I wrote my first book out of that. Now, archives have problems. They can be read in many different ways, but they don't move, or at least they don't move often. So my first book was basically a reinterpretation of the archive. My PhD, that book came from, was conducted, I think, probably a few weeks before George W. Bush invaded Iraq. And so I have spent the last, when we were at 2003, so the last 21 years reflecting on that single event and its aftermath. So as again Joseph mentioned very kindly, my second book, Iraq from War to a New Authoritarianism, was my first attempt to work out what was going on. Now, I will freely admit that in 20 years, I think 15 or 18 of those years was spent, firstly, very angry with the carnage that George W. Bush and the United States unleashed on Iraq and the civil war that followed. But secondly, responding to events on the ground. And that book is a product of that. I don't think it's a bad book, but I think it's very much should have to save me the embarrassment, work in progress put across the top. So I went to Baghdad in 2003 as before the civil war started. I went back in 2007 and 8, and I've started going regularly, like 4 or 5 times a year in 2011. But if you look at that book, the interviewing in it is minimal and informal. Anecdotes, confidential insights are footnoted in quite a haphazard way. And most of that book, although informed by my ethnographic research on the ground, my interviewing, is anchored into news media. And then if you look at the journal articles that I've published as a political scientist, I think journal articles are more important, as important to me, and it's where I do my thinking, as opposed to historians and single authored books. The interviewing comes slowly, and still very slowly, I think, and the insights of interviewing come slowly. So as Joseph said, it's the next book that has, I think, now 113 interviews, and is based on a series of visits to Iraq from uh, 2003 onwards, and is based on this set of elite interviews. Now, there's a reason why I have to interview, and that comes with the project of the book, the hypothesis of the book. So there is no accessible archive in Iraq, I think, that covers the post 2003 period. I have heavily used English language newspapers and have started now to heavily use Arabic newspapers. There are actually some wonderful Arabic newspapers that have been published in Iraq. I think Al Mada would be, Sot al Iraq is one, but Al Mada is probably the best. But when you go to that, and unsurprisingly, you find day-to-day reflections, like most news media, on what's just happened. And so it hadn't given me, and also Shakal al-Assad, al-Sabah, al-Kabas, al-Quds al-Arabi, all the pan-Arab media kept very costly in terms of money, but also life of the journalists, major bureaus in Iraq all the way through the civil war. But that civil war, we can debate from 2004, certainly 2005, all the way through to 2007, 8, 9, depending, kept the vast majority of researchers. There's only one individual, I think, the wonderful Iraqi Harith al-Hassan, who's written a book-length manuscript on on the aftermath of 2003, with on-the-ground research through the Civil War. And that's because his family was based there and he was going back and forward. The rest of us, I think, had to do a lot of, because the violence was so great, had to do a lot of research at second hand or briefly come in on very costly and risky trips. Which means I would argue that researchers like yourselves, like me, like Joseph, need a great deal of time to sit on the ground, to do research, to gather enough data for book-length projects. And at best, that would be 2011 when that became possible, but possibly more realistically, about 2013, 2014. I was lucky at the London School of Economics that they were willing, I've been there 11 years. So for 11 years, they've been willing to grant me that very mundane thing, which my life partner insists on, life insurance, to go to Iraq. And universities that I know, like Oxford and Cambridge, have only relatively recently granted that. So there's a series of really mundane issues that have stopped researchers until 2011, 2014 going to Iraq, and that's insecurity and violence. The kidnapping of a Princeton student, what's that, 2 years ago now, has also put that back into question. So I think that there are insecurities, but the core hypothesis of my book and the driving issue around it is that this political system that we see in Iraq, the issues involved in it, its violence, its corruption, its instability, and as we saw after the Tishreen movement, the rejection of it by the mass majority of young people have come out of an Iraq, specifically Iraqi agency. So it's the Iraqi elites that built this state that has failed the Iraqi people. Now, that's not uncontroversial. The comrades amongst us who are post-colonial, who are anti-imperial would say, how can you let the Americans off the hook? And I can't. And every chapter that I've written on economics, on coercion, starts with the United States agency in 2003, 2004, and onwards for a couple of years, the infamous Paul Bremer, amongst others, outlines what they were trying to build, but then examines the death of those institutions, that ideological vision as it was taken over by ordinary Iraqis. Now, if we look at the most recently published books on Iraq, in themselves aren't bad. But Mervyn Leffler's Confronting Saddam Hussein is the one example I would give, and Roger Peterson's Death, Dominance, and State Building, which I think is an excellent book. But both of those show, I think, the profound problems in the historiography of contemporary Iraqi history. Firstly, Leffler's book is indeed built on a series of an enviably rich series of interviews. But Leffler obviously didn't read Leanne Fuji's book before he started conducting those interviews. And what he's used those elite interviews to do is firstly to interview a series of American decision makers. There is not one single Iraqi interviewed in that book. And the book itself doesn't get to Iraq till the second half of the final chapter. And all of that is based on interviews with Americans, primarily Paul Bremer, where they broadly say it wasn't me, but it wasn't my fault this has become such a debacle. And I think Roger Peterson's book, although it's an excellent book, is broadly based on interviews with American combat veterans. So it is clearly a view from the ground up, with an encyclopedic examination of everything that's been published since 2003. But it is also, again, I think he would agree with this, unapologetically an Americocentric view. Now, my hypothesis is that it isn't, after 2004-5, the Americans who are the agents, the Americans who are responsible to have the agency, have the activism of driving the Iraqi. And it may, I argue, may not even be the Americans from 2003 to 2005. If you look at the key infamous decisions, the disbanding of the Iraqi army, de-Baathification, the setting up of the Iraqi Governing Council, I would argue, and this is way open to contestation, so feel free if you want, they were taken broadly by Iraqi lobbying of American decision makers. So I think what I'm trying to do is go actually back to the 1990s, the Salahuddin conference in 1992, if memory serves me right, and look at the agency of the Iraqis in opposition, look at their vision that they bring back, and then look at how that shaped the formation of the Iraqi state that we have today. Now, this is the punchline that gets me to the interviewing. You cannot do that without interviewing. You cannot do that without extended access to the elite who took those decisions. Now, certainly there are two types of questions you can ask that elite. What happened when? That's the first set of questions. But I think broadly we know what happened when. I know when most of the decisions were taken, but I don't know quite why and how those decisions were taken. The process of negotiation through which these decisions were taken. Now, I know you're working on Middle Eastern studies, most of you, or in fact, all of you. And I would venture, though, from a point of view of comparative ignorance, what I've done in these series of interviews, asking who took the decisions and why, would be very, very difficult. in most countries. And so if you went to Egypt and asked Sisi what he did and why, I don't think you would be in the country. If you were lucky long, you'd be expelled. Even if you went to Tunisia and asked the process through which the revolution was betrayed and demobilized, I don't think you're going to find a lot of traction. But in the case of Iraq, partly because of the time I've spent and the number of trips of going back and forward since 2003, but also partly because of the transnational origins of the elite, this elite has been open for interviewing. Now, Leanne Fuji makes the powerful point, and it's one that everyone should learn, that we're not after truth. Because if we were after truth through interviewing, we would have a lot of failed interviews. I did 2 interviews in Baghdad on one night with 2 former prime ministers. I'll anonymize this as best I can. The first prime minister I knew very well, was very close to him, had known him for years, saw him relatively recently at his house in Europe. So let's keep that anonymous. The second interview I'd been after for an awful long time was with probably one of the most unpopular prime ministers in Iraq. And he'd been refusing to see me. And he was quite infamous for what he'd done. So I go into the first prime minister's house in those days that I consumed alcohol, and he said, "Let's have a whiskey." Which I would say if you're offered alcohol or big food when you arrive at a place, it always seems to me to be a sign that the interview isn't going to go well, because something else is happening. Interviewees are putting on the table distractions or other things. Hospitality, certainly. So I'd read his autobiography in Arabic, or 2 volumes of it, which was rather elongated process. And I thought I understood his role in what we could call the militarization of the Iraqi military. So I posed to him this question, "But sir, weren't you?" And he said, "No, that wasn't me. I've always been against it." So it's an untruth. And I rather foolhardily pushed him on it and quoted the section from the autobiography where, in my mind, he outlines the first integration of the militias from his party and others into the Iraqi army. And the person sitting with him said, "You mistranslated that. Your Arabic isn't very good." Now, that's clearly the point. My Arabic isn't very good, but I hadn't mistranslated it. I tried and translated it, and I had it translated twice by other people to make sure it was accurate. And I was furious, and I felt betrayed. So I left feeling like being lied to, got in the car and drove to the second ex-prime minister's house. Now, I think Leanne Fuji would say that's a classic mistake, and driven by the egotism of an interviewer. If I'd have reflected on my practice, as she says, as she begs us to in a relational way, I'd have said, "Who am I, a relatively unimportant researcher who's taken the time to translate and read this prime minister's autobiography, to call him on it and to be angry that what he was trying to do was explain what he saw his role was in the formation of the army." That would be the first point. The second point was that I came into the second ex-prime minister's house. He'd just come back from his farm in southern Iraq, looking very tanned and relaxed. And I came in and I was honest with him. I'd never had any rapport with him, didn't particularly like him. And I said, "I apologize. Can you give me a minute? I'm really angry because I believe that I've just been lied to." And this man rocked back in his chair and roared with laughter and said, "How long have you been working on Iraq?" I said, "Well, so over 20 years. He said, "Have you never been lied to before? Or are you a fool and you never noticed that you were lied to?" And that was a telling rebuke. And then he went on to say, this is a direct quote, which is why I've anonymized this anecdote. Well, it'll be more than an anecdote. It is more than an anecdote. But don't you know, we're all the Iraqi elite, liars or self-deluding. And I looked at him and I was fearful. And you know why I was fearful? Because I hadn't set the terms of the interview. I didn't know whether this was on or off the record or both. And he said to me, you know, most Iraqi politicians are profoundly corrupt. And by this time, I'm now really worried. And I'm taking notes. I have one of these black books in my hand and I'm scribbling down. He said, but some of us may not think we're corrupt. We may take the money and claim it's for good reason, but we're all corrupt. We all take money from the state and use it in unregulated way. Now, I think that shows 3 or 4 different things. The first thing was it was outrageously egotistical for me to be angry with an interviewee and to show it and to let it affect the next interview. But as Fuji says, there's no such thing as a failure in an interview because when I came into the second interview that I was clearly agitated and somewhat upset in a way that I don't fully understand, that I'd gained the second interviewee's, if not trust, maybe contempt, but clearly I wasn't to him. And the rest of the interview, which went on for 3 hours, him in its way, and not in an insulting way, Iraqi politics, his role and others, that I was clearly too dumb to pick up on my own. So the situation unfolded, not with, and keep in mind that Fuji says that rapport is not a bad thing, but we shouldn't aim for a kind of personalized, charismatic rapport with our interviewees. What we should aim for is a working relationship which places them as an end, not a means, i.e., so you're not pumping them for information for your PhD or the great book that you're going to write. You're interacting with them as another human who deserves respect and that you cannot in any way place in danger. So I think from that and from those insights, we learn a few things. Firstly, when I come in to interview, I have a target list, unfortunate terminology, but bear with me, of interviewees that I want to see every time I go to Baghdad, Erbil, Basra. And let's keep in mind, there's no such thing as failure, which is very reassuring. And I chant that Fuji word, that Fuji line every time I fly out of Baghdad with 5 interviews, 4 interviews, 6 interviews, or sometimes I get 20, depending on how lucky I am. But the point is, what you're doing is gathering both data, formal data that will go into the book, but a kind of wider sense of network. You do snowball research. Well, interviewing is snowball. People are testing you out, seeing what you want. So the first thing that I do is draft a list, an ongoing list, updating. So when I'm reading newspapers, when I get research data, I immediately highlight who the key players are and put them on an ever expanding and ultimately non-realizable list of interviews. And then when I go to Baghdad, and this is the problem with a 20-year research project, if those people aren't dead, mostly of old age, the elite don't kill each other, or aren't in exile, and I try to seek them out. Now, again, let me anonymize this. One of the most infamous ex-ministers of Interior, who was responsible for a great deal of the carnage in the Civil War, I finally got through to his son and said, could I interview him? And I always say, it's completely off the record. None of this will be quoted. If he doesn't want to do, he has the choice of it, a kind of standard interview protocol. And the son said, why can't you leave my father alone? I said, doesn't he want to talk? He said, I don't want him to talk. He's an old man now. He has nothing to say. This is in the past. And there you had a family interlocutor trying to protect his father from himself, from me, from further publicity. What's intriguing is this man still views himself as an active politician. Anyway, so I draw up a list of people that I want to see. That list is ever expanding, and keep in mind to keep your own depression or pessimism in check, that list is never completely realizable. It's a wish list, like a Christmas list I used to draw up as a child. I'll never get all the presents, and I might get a few of them, but it's an ongoing database of people that I might be able to talk to. I then try, and this is me self-disciplining, outline what a success in Baghdad might look like. Would 15 interviews, 20, and I have again a database of people I've interviewed on the separate trips that I've been to. I think 17 maybe trips, and the success rate. I wouldn't look at the data, the interviews, and say what is, you know, what have I learned, what have I gleaned. I can remember the key interviews that I've given, and some of the data that I've got from that, which has made my hair stand on end. It's been so revelatory, but that is a coincidence, not an outcome of my hard work. So I draw this list up, and then I either sit, and this is, I hate doing this. So I sit with my Iraqi mobile and its WhatsApp feature, and I reach out and reach out, and then I reach out. If I can't reach out directly to those people, I reach out to people who may know them, or people who may know people who know them. Now that undoubtedly is an encumbrance. You're intervening in people's lives at a cost to them. Now it may be at its minimum a cost in terms of time. But given the violent history of contemporary Iraq, it may range up to a direct cost in people's lives. And then I do use research assistants, interlocutors based in Baghdad who have different types of networks than I do. Now, again, that raises a series of different questions. Do they have a better success rate than me because it's all relational, and these are usually young, fairly educated, but liberal and almost certainly oppositional young activists? Do they really want to go and see these people? Do they really want to interact with them? The answer is, yeah, sometimes yes, sometimes no. But I'm undoubtedly putting them in difficult situations that I need to discuss with them in great detail. Do you mind doing this? Is it going to put you in danger? This is what I'm going to be talking about. Are you okay about that? And then if I'm lucky to get a promise of an interview, I treat that as a wish, as a hope, because it may be put off and put off. There's one prime minister I've interviewed twice, but I would like to interview 3 or 4 times more. And each time I ring his private secretary when I arrive in Baghdad, he's never in Baghdad. It's amazing. His travel plan seems to me the exact opposite to mine. There's another very senior politician who was driven into exile by that politician, who again is never in Baghdad when I'm in Baghdad, but always in Erbil when I'm in Erbil. And clearly I decide not to be offended, not to think it's anything personal, though it clearly is, but to suggest that for that senior politician, he has decided not to be seen with me, not to interact with me in Baghdad, but it's perfectly comfortable to do that in Erbil, which is rather bizarre because I then interview people he knows and I say, have you seen this person? They say, yeah, he was here last week or he's here today. But he'll always say, no, next time in Erbil, let's meet there. So what you're doing is interacting with key individuals in this relational way that Fuji lays out, and you're trying to decenter yourself in terms of your own demands, your own egotism, your own needs, but also reflect on what you bring to the interview. The vulnerability that you put your research assistant into, the vulnerability you may well put your interviewee into, or the fact that you may be taking, as Fuji's, I think, incredibly powerfully lays out, that you're taking them back to events that will be traumatic, that will make them relive things that they'd rather not, and that there is a huge amount. I was in Iraq before 2003, and Joseph, I know, has done work like this, and it was much worse then, but all the more obvious that whenever you met an Iraqi under the previous Ba'athist regime, there would be an implicit, because it could never be explicit, deal struck between you and the person that you were interviewing. Basically, I am talking to you, the Iraqi under the Ba'ath regime would say, but if you misuse this data, I will die. And I would see older colleagues, probably people now that I'm now their age, which is a scary thought, who've been in and out of Iraq under the Ba'athist regime so much and struck so many implicit deals that they hadn't noted down, that their notes were not full, for good reason that they did. They had to anonymize them not to cause danger, that they never wrote anything about Iraq. So basically, when you strike the implicit or the explicit deal with your interviewee, you need to make it clear to them, but also make it clear to yourself with extensive notes. And you need to think, what are the terms I'm striking? So before I go to the interview, I would go through all the notes that I had made previously, and then I would lay out the political trajectory of the individual I'm interviewing. I would do this in hand note, because I very rarely take electronic media to Baghdad because it makes you very vulnerable. And I would lay it out, and I would think, what is the best outcome for this interview? What would be the gold dust that this interviewee could share with me? And of course, almost always I'm wrong, and I'll get to that in a minute. And I would lay out the sequence of questions that I would want to ask them in one of these notebooks. And then I would start off moving slowly through the interviewing, trying to establish at least a working relationship, trying to establish trust after I had explicitly put on the table the terms of the interview. This can be completely off the record. This can be on the record. This can be in deep background. You can quote this, or we can have a written or verbal agreement that anything that I quote from you I will run past you before it gets to publication. There are a series of gradations that your ethics committee at Georgetown will be very aware of, running from verbal agreements through to written agreements. Now, the point about the Iraqi elite, I would suggest, is they have been so media satirized, they've been so heavily interviewed by the international and local media, the international media that they cannot control, that they are very aware of this, and they are very skilled operators between off the record and on the record, and they are very aware about what they say can and cannot harm them. And I'll give you another example of a very senior Kurdish politician who used to hate me. And so I wanted to go and interview him. And I took a good friend of mine's father with me, who had been a minister in this individual's government. And we turned up, and there was a massive lunch. I thought, oh, this isn't a good sign. And the lunch went on, and I had to go back the next day because the lunch was indeed a diversion. But by that time, we'd established. And he did a series of, it'll be the backbone of the book, of interviews with me over 2 years. But what he would do is jump on and off the record. That's off the record. You can't quote that. And so what I'd have to do is take very careful notes to make sure that when I got back to London to type up those notes, it was heavily flagged up what was on and off the record. The second thing you may think is, why don't I tape interviews? Why do I take this arcane situation of taking extensive notes in A3 note? I have taken the decision, which may be an anachronistic and an old man's decision, to take handwritten notes, because I think it's reassuring that if you're interacting with an individual with a tape recorder, there is a precision in the recording. You can turn it off and on, you can remove it, you can put it in your bag, but you're introducing a piece of technology that individuals know is unforgiving. If you're taking handwritten notes, there's a flexibility, a fluidity, and a deniability. No, I didn't say that, but he's got notes. Well, he made it up. And I think the informality of taking handwritten notes means, in my view, and this is a choice that hundreds of social science um, researchers would disagree with, I've decided to take handwritten notes. So you firstly research who you want to interview. you then research who you'd want, what you'd want to ask if you obtained a promise of that interview. When you get into the situation, ethnographically, what I do is then note where I am, what the mood is, what the furniture is, how the interviewee is dressed, who they're sitting with, and what the mood is. And if the mood changes, as you know, this can last 2 or 3 hours, I note that as well. And what you do is establish the ground rules for the interview. And this can range from the informal to the formal, the verbal, but it's always about permission to disclose. Is this on the record? Is it off the record? What parts of this interview do you want on and off the record? And what do you want me to do before I quote you? Now, again, as I said, most senior Iraqi politicians are used to giving interviews. They've given hundreds of interviews in the past. And so they're usually quite comfortable with this. But there is undoubtedly a basis to a trust being established in the ground rules. And then you get on with the interview. Now, I think I have a structured plan for nearly every interview that I do. It may be short, it may be long, and it may be completely unrealistic. But what I want to do is take the interviewee from a fairly innocuous place where some form of trust and working relationship between us is established to more controversial and difficult issue. It may not work, but also I usually start off by asking every interviewee their backstory, where they were born, what their main influences were as a child, how they came into politics if it's a member of the elite, and how they evolved. And that, I would suggest, has given me some of the most powerful insights into the elite that I'm interviewing. Because those that created the new Iraqi state were all about the same age. They left Iraq about the same time as Saddam Hussein stepped up his repression, and they came back in a certain way. And I asked them also, which I thought was a fairly innocuous question, so how did you feel when you came back, usually to Baghdad? And I'll give you three examples. A member of the KDP, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, the major Kurdish party in the north, a member of the Iraqi Communist Party, and a member of the two members of the Dawa Islamic Party. And I asked them how they felt when they came to Baghdad, and all four of them gave me the same example, that they felt disorientated and they felt fearful, not at that time because there were threats to their safety, but because they couldn't find their way around a city that they'd been excluded from for 20, 30 years. And they weren't sure how they'd be represented. One of these senior politicians tells a story of walking down the path of his family house and knocking on the door, and his sister opening the door and not recognizing him. Now, what does this mean? Well, I think I've taken it and I've written it. It means to some extent that they believed, I think incorrectly, but really powerfully, that they were working in a hostile environment, almost a tabula rasa that they had to impose themselves on. And if you think that was a similar response from a senior Kurdish politician, an Iraqi communist, and a Dawa Islamist Shia religious politician. And those questions were, for me, delivered to put them at ease, because I thought to begin with that they were non-controversial issues, and they've given me some of the most powerful insights, founding insights, framing insights into the book. So I think that's the first issue, and I think so. Keep drawing up and expanding a wish list of the interviewees you want. You will test that against reality, and it will be failing. You will not get all the interviews, but keep going, and then be open and profoundly surprised about what data you get, what insights you get. And I think Fuji's point that failure isn't actually failure, it's another step on the learning path. That if you have a bad interview, that you have an obstreperous interviewee, if you have someone who rejects you, it's not actually a rejection. It's a learning process. The example of the senior politician in the Iraqi army, I think, is a good one. And thirdly, I think never be afraid to admit your almost complete ignorance. I'm not an Iraqi. I go to Iraq, I know a bit about Iraq, but I very much, in my reflexive way, assume I'm a visitor in a country and I'm asking people who put their lives on the line, many of whom have lost family members who've fought, been in exile, about a country that's there. And so I always admit if I don't know something, and if I'm corrected or told I'm wrong, I accept that. A central part of the book is how the Mahasasa, the bargaining political system, was set up. And I met a senior Iraqi politician who's not widely known, but is probably one of the most influential power brokers in Iraq. And I started off by giving him a date when intra-political party was formed to work out the balance of sectarian appointments within ministry. And he leant over and he said, I thought you knew a bit about Iraq. That's completely wrong. The date's wrong. The makeup of the committee is wrong. And its functioning is wrong. And I rocked back in my chair. And instead of going, I've got my data and I've got it right, I said, really? Well, that's fascinating. So when was it? And because he thought, quite rightly, because he had, that he'd somehow asserted his authority over the interview. He told me who was on the committee, who worked out the sectarian balance of the Iraqi civil service. And I could feel the hairs on the back of my head going up. He told me how it functioned, the year it started. And of course, the next interview I had was someone who I've just been told was on the committee. So we'd run through a similar thing. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? When did you come back to Baghdad? And I said, I was told that you were on this committee and that you were a key, you were key, you had input into how the sectarian balance of the civil service. Now, this stuff is incredibly controversial. It was in my mind. Oh, yes, that's right. We see, it was a lovely bloke that the guy gave me the information, though I didn't divulge. And yet we sat on that committee for several years. And so I'm sitting there looking at the engine room of the sectarianization, the politicization, the removal of any autonomy from the senior civil service, a crucial theme in my own research that I'd stumbled across because I'd got a date wrong in a previous interview. Now, it's not possibly that those Iraqi politicians were hiding that. It's clearly that they didn't see it as particularly controversial, but that I'd stumbled across it and they didn't think it was worth discussing, and then we discussed it. Now, the other point that I think Leanne Fuji makes that really sticks with me is about the type of data that you expect to get from a series of relational interactive interviews. Now, I think the crucial thing for me is not to judge whether these politicians that I'm interviewing are lying or telling the truth, because I don't think ultimately that's a fruitful venture, because the truth will be somewhere in between. But to judge their own understanding of their truth and why they did what they did. And I think that comes out of Fuji's book extremely well, that you're there to try and understand how they see their world and then the ramifications of that. Now, I've spent many years writing, trying to critique and understand how so quickly, between 2003 and 2009, probably, the Iraqi political field became heavily sectarian and then was desectarianized. But I'll tell you this, in all my interviewing, and I've no reason to doubt it, senior politicians believe deeply and uncontradictory that Iraq was a deeply sectarian place. Now, that deliberately sits at odds with my own understanding of the empirical situation. But it's not for me to disagree. It's for me to continue to interview, to interact with them and ask why they believe that and what the ramifications are. The ramifications were the political system that's built, that dominates Iraq today, and the way the elections were conducted, certainly in 2005, but 2010 and 2014. So I don't what I need to understand is why the senior politicians believed it was that Iraqi society was sectarian, and why they then set up their political system to do that. I have to believe them. I think they believe it's true. And I trace the ramifications, although in previous writings and other people were writing in a way that would suggest that those politicians deliberately drove that situation to create a space for themselves to maximize their political power, that instrumental argument. I'm not sure I believe that, but let's go there. Right. So let's see what we've done, because I've been speaking now for probably a little bit too long, but Joseph's face is tolerant. Oh, I'm reading his face in this interviewing technique. Um, Firstly, what I've laid out is my own research trajectory, which took me away from an archivist working in the British Public Records Office over 10 years, joyous experience, to seeking to understand the political system that was born in Iraq after 2003. That forced me to formalize, to reflect, and to build my interview technique. As previously, I built my archival technique. As previously, I read and worked a lot on social theory, on understanding my Marx, my Foucault, or my Bourdieu. So it's not a dissimilar thing. Methodology, I think, is like comparative theory or getting to know a country. It's just something you do. And in that process, I came across Leanne Fuji's book. And the reason I stress it so much is it both explained to me what was unfolding in my interviewing, put it in perspective, helped me to deal with it, and helped me to broadly live with it and turn my interviewing experiences into methodology and into data that has written this book with only 3 more chapters to complete before it goes to the publishers. So I think I would, which is why I stress Fuji's point, and I think Fuji's point is maybe 3 or 4-fold. Firstly, you recognize the power differentials involved in an American graduate from a Washington University or a British middle class, middle aged man from a London elite university going to a country and asking questions. There is an undoubted power differential, but there's also a very different differential that when we turn up, we cannot control or possibly even manage how we are viewed. So we have to roll with it. And that goes from research ethics right through to mediating the danger that you would face in any Middle Eastern country at the moment. I think, secondly, this reflexivity should force you to question your own ego, your own centrality in the interviewing process, but to treat your interviewees not as vehicles to an end, a data gathering tool for your PhD or your book, but a means and end, people who are living their lives in a lot more precarious and precious a way than you are, probably. And that interacting with them very carefully and trying to read what you're doing to them, how they're responding to you, and the data that comes out of it. And thirdly, the data that comes out of it, I think, is not for me primarily facts, truth or lies, um, empirical data that can be deployed on a spreadsheet or a graph. It gives you a sense of how these key individuals understand their life worlds, to use a term, the political field that they're operating in, the cultural field, the economic field they're operating in, and what the ramifications are for politics, for economics, for sociology, for anthropology, whatever it is. So I think the lessons we learn from Fuji are profound, but humbling. And to a certain extent, they decenter us and force us to reflect on our methodology of interviewing. And also, I think the big thing that I learned from her, which is why I take her whenever I travel, the book at least, is that success may not look like success. So, I take these black notebooks to Iraq with me. Sometimes I come home and it's only the first 3 pages that are full. Sometimes I come home and all 3 books are full. And I cannot tell you why the productivity, in quotation marks, of what I'm doing changes from trip to trip. I just think that's the situation That's the randomness of what we're doing. I prepare the same each time. So interviewing is not a predictable, necessarily efficient way of working. But there are some circumstances, like the book I'm writing on Iraq at the minute, that it's unavoidable and it's incredibly rich. And if you're using Fuji's method, it's also a way to integrate your work self, or at least to get access to the life worlds of the people that you're studying on a basis that allows them to speak and explain their own experiences and what's happening to them. So it decenters you, recenters them, and allows you to gain insights into what they're doing. And at nearly past, I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Really remarkable. I obviously no one has ever done this in Iraq at all, and I think this is really groundbreaking. I just have one quick question before taking other questions from the students. Um, you mentioned the research interlocutors, and in the book also it talks, Andy, about it a lot. Um, do you use them also as translators sometimes, or do you interview in one language, or do you change? Sometimes is it in English, sometimes it's in Arabic, depending, because I think that also is important.
I think, as you quite rightly indicate, I think Fuji's discussion on language and on understanding linguistic structures is both really important and somewhat aspirational, given that she was moving between Rwanda, I think, possibly the Congo and other areas. So
Mhm.
yes, I do use translators. I'll move, depending, because these are elites, I'll move between Arabic and English. The elite has transformed in Iraq as old people have either died or gone back to their places of exile as they've been peripherized. But I'm in a hybrid situation where there's a wonderful moment that I was interviewing a very senior and rather scary militia leader, and I was with my research assistant, who was a younger Iraqi, and they said, "Look, I'm really worried. This guy is a murderer." And I say, "Yes, he is. But if you look at his record, he's only murdered old white men, usually Americans, not Brits. But so the chances are you might get out of this. If it goes wrong, it won't be me." But we were doing the interview and he was making a specific point, and I understood the point, and she was finding it difficult to translate. And he said, "You no need to translate. He understands." And so again, this is the kind of relational issue that he wasn't sure why she was there, because he thought my Arabic was good enough to conduct the interview itself. Now it's not. I'm not. I'm too old to pretend my Arabic is that good, but my Arabic is good enough to follow, to change, to see when the terms of the interview changes, and in this case, to pick up a situation where he knew I was understanding and following, and he didn't think it necessary, but also he thought it was probably a theatrical encumbrance for her to translate. So I do, yes, use translators, but with Fuji's kind of hope that you follow the linguistics, the structures, the change, how the language is used. My Arabic is probably good enough to do that, but I would make no claims for that beyond the assistance that I need and use of both research assistants and translators.
Another question is, what do you do with um, items that you know that are fabricated, or especially given all the corruption in the past, and someone says to you, I have definitely no involvement in this issue, but from three other sources. Do you challenge them? Do you just skip and get on with it?
That's a great question. An example I gave you of the militarization of the army and this senior politician's key role in that he was then denying, I think is a really telling example for me. That I ended the interview early and left because I thought, I'd actually now not sure, but I thought I was being lied at. I had evidence, different forms of evidence, that he had participated in the integration of political party militias into the army. Now, what was gained for me from doing that, stalking out in a sulky way? Nothing at all. And what would be of gain for me challenging that? Had a spectacular interview in 2007 with Ahmed Chalabi when he still had an office in the grounds of the Iraqi parliament. Now, I think everyone, if they don't know, then sorry for my kind of Iraqocentrism, but people know Ahmed Chalabi's background, the collapsing of a bank in Amman, the collapsing of a bank in Beirut, and sustained evidence, should we say, of financial malfeasance. But he also, as someone who was an ex-banker and had an incredibly fine mind, had a very, I don't know if the right word is encyclopedic, but had a very detailed knowledge of corruption across the rest of the elite. And the interview that he gave me was kind of dazzling of its alleged revelations. Now, was any of that data useful? No, I couldn't use it. It was confidential, but it was also probably unreliable. But the fact that I was sitting with Chalabi in his office, in him detailing these structures as given. Now, there's also something else that I think this question raises, which is sensitivity. And we all have to fill out risk assessment forms before we go to the field. And there are issues that you can talk about and are discussed in great detail in the Iraqi papers. And there are issues that surprise me that are sensitive. Now, corruption is talked about on an everyday basis, and that the so-called heist of the century, this massive theft from Iraqi government coffers of VAT refunds, I think tax refunds. That's talked about in great detail, and you can interview on that. And that never ceases to amaze me that I can sit in front of politicians and they will talk about how the system encourages corruption and how corruption works to fund parties. You go into specific detail because this corrupt system is run by what are called economic offices in the parties, and I have not in any way managed to get that detail and have been told on occasion, no, you know, warnings about your danger always come with, Toby, you're a great friend of mine. I would hate to see anything happen to you. Don't pursue this line of questioning. So, oh, thank you. That's very kind. And you just, right, that's sensitive. I'll have to find the data elsewhere. And the other thing is the military. So I've now got a coherent, I think, and a fairly well-researched chapter on the politicization of the military. And I thought, oh, if corruption can be talked about in great detail, so can the military. And I remember going to a series of familiar interlocutors who have military backgrounds and military connections, and I'm just stepping back and saying, no, we won't talk about this, or them simply not. And then I got an interview with a retired, very senior Iraqi military figure. And as we drove up to his house, his chef was cooking kebabs outside in the front garden. I knew that was a bad sign, and we had an absolutely spectacular meal. There's not an ounce of fat on him. He didn't eat much, but the meal was hospitality, and the meal was to stop me interviewing him, basically. And he now does actually feature in that chapter, but the quote that he gave me is fairly anodyne and it's not specific. So I can never tell until I arrive which interlocutor will be comfortable about talking at. And there's whole subjects that are not, but they're not the ones you think, I think would be the case. There was a murder in Baghdad of an American who I think turned out to be a missionary. He was shot. His daughter and wife weren't. I remember turning up and thinking, and everyone in Baghdad knew who'd carried out, who knew the group, which is often the way, knew the group who carried out the murder. I think the individual has been arrested and also indicted. And I remember talking to security contacts who I knew very well, and they're just not refusing. I saying, but we know who did it. I don't know anything about that. And they didn't even say, I won't talk about that. It's dangerous to work. I won't know anything about that. And these are individuals who, on other incredibly sensitive issues, had long discussions with me in confidence, and trust them in. They just wouldn't touch that. So you never know. And you don't push, and I don't confront. No, to answer your question directly, there is nothing to be gained from confrontation.
One question that is here, how can researchers and interviewers prevent themselves from giving into their bias while conducting interviews? There will be always those who they have closer relationship with, and on the other hand, those who they find to be problematic. To what extent should a researcher go to build relationship with these uh, interviewers, or
I,
not?
I think that's a brilliant question. Sorry to cut you off there. And I think there are two different answers. The first is uh, avoiding bias is simply impossible. Marginalizing your bias to the fact that it doesn't matter is simply impossible. But recognizing and reflecting on your bias is not. Now, over 30 years of researching Iraqi politics, um, I have politicians I'm close to personally. I have groups of political parties and things that I have a dislike for. But those have shifted over the years. But also doing interviews and ascertaining insights means that I will talk to everyone and that I will try as much as possible to minimize my bias. The politician I mentioned who previously hated me. That was a clear case. He thought I was biased against his party and the the ethno-sectarian group it represented. I would argue that I wasn't. I just thought they were given a free ride in the media. He picked that up, and I remember saying to him after these long interviews, "Why are you talking to me? You never used to talk to me." And he said, "I'd written the book. The second book was quite pointedly critical about the Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, and he loved it. So I really, I didn't like you, I didn't trust you, but I thought this was a good piece of work, and I wanted to. And of course, what he might have meant was that was very critical of a politician. I want to get my defense in first through the interview. Either way, he interviewed, and I got into it.
Another thing that Fuji talks about is, sometimes, um, quote unquote, to get paid, obviously, I'm sure none of them ask you for money, but what do you do when they ask you for favor, be it in Iraq with someone else or back in Europe? Can you arrange this? Can you do this for me or my family?
I think there is a case in Iraq of media organizations paying fixers. And they would say, "What's wrong with that? That's my job." But whenever I've seen that practice in process, the outcomes have never been particularly efficient. I would put it like that, I think. Yes, there's, not. I mean, we both work at elite universities that students want to study at, so mostly the issue is about getting access to studying at LSE. Now, I say to them, they don't probably believe it, but it happens to be true. I have no influence at all in LSE. Try and order a cup of tea, let alone getting a student in a place. And I say this, you're talking to the wrong person. I remember one ex-Iraqi prime minister. I had a long interview with him. And he was clearly, and I thought deludedly, waiting for to be invited back to power to become prime minister again. And as I left, he hugged me and said, "Tell them in London I'm ready." And I thought, well, who would I tell in London? I could tell Joseph, but I don't think that's what he had in mind. So that's the other worrying issue. The politicians often think that you have network, that you're not only what you seem to be, you're something else. And there is a paranoia or a sense you've got more influence in government or organization. I would say, look, I don't, and you can ask a lot of me, but I can't deliver it. So that's yeah. So not payment, but favors are
sometimes asked for, but I don't have the ability to deliver. So I say, like, I'm really sorry about this, but I can't get you into LSE. I can't get the British government to back you or campaign for being prime minister. But I still want to hear about your insights into Iraq. Is that okay?
One last question before we finish. Is it possible to conduct scholarship without implicit normative basis, ways in which our makings of meaning themselves bias our attempts to soberly understand the views of others? If so, what role might acknowledging power difference and positionalities vis-a-vis potentially embedded norms?
That's great. I think, the short answer of the first part of the question, is it possible to escape your biases, is no. But I think what good scholarship does is to a large an extent as possible, is recognize those biases and put it on the table. So, the first two chapters of this book I'm writing are expanding on the previous literature that's been written on Iraq after 2003 and saying, this is why I don't like that, or I wouldn't write a book like that. This is what's wrong with that, and this is what I'm going to do differently. And that's a way of unpacking and explaining to your audience how you're doing it. And then the second chapter is simply a theoretical and methodological chapter explaining how you're going to do it and why. So, it's very unfair to state the political system. No one seems to be doing that anywhere in the world around. And so what I do is explain that, why I'm doing that, and what's involved in the history of the concept, both in Iraq and globally. And when I go to try and find the state, which in Iraq is not as straightforward as you can imagine, what does that mean? So I use the term fractured state in my book title to refer to a whole literature. And in referring to that literature, I say, look, you don't have to take me on trust. I'm discussing this literature because I think it's useful to explaining the situation in Iraq. If you don't, if you think this is somehow an obscurantist approach or is getting in the way, an encumbrance, fine. Don't read that chapter or don't read the book. But it's really, I have struggled for 10 years to understand the relationship between Iraq's ruling elite, especially during the civil war, but afterwards, because they were fighting, they were using violence against each other. Lots of people were killed, but they clearly colluded to build a certain type of system. So you have competition, violence, corruption, and collusion
Mm.
that brings one outcome, and unpacking that, the terms of collusion, the terms of violence, the terms of corruption, the terms of ideology, and seeing how that made that system. That seems to me to be a brilliant, obviously I've spent most of my last 20 years doing it, a brilliant thing to do and a great approach. And that's involved in, I always say to my young colleagues, what I'm trying to find is a kind of explanatory key. So I have another colleague who's a superb scholar of Iraq, lived in Iraq, worked in the Iraqi government for a year, and he always says it's like punching jelly that he can't explain. And I say, well, let's just gently agree to differ. I think I can explain what's going on. I think you need to kind of pull the focus back a bit and deploy concepts that work. But I think I can explain. Maybe it's the conceit and arrogance of a academic, but I think I can do that. And I can only do that through deploying units of analysis that may have come from my own bias, but that are overtly put on the table, subject to questioning, situated within a literature, then deployed. And so that three-stage process on the table, overtly examined, explained where they come on, then deployed as explanatory tools. That means they're overt and not hidden. My biases are there. I also think a great deal of the literature on Iraq, until comparatively recently, is structured by an unquestioned assumption that Iraqi society is divided into ethno-sectarian groups. Now, I don't think it is necessarily, and I think, but you need to open up that assumption and question it. And most of my work for the last 6, 7 years has been doing that. Where does sectarianism come from?
why does it increase and at the moment decrease within Iraqi politics and then sometimes increase again? What are the driving factors? So sectarianism is a key concept in my lexicon. I don't like it. I have a bias against it, but it will inform and does inform my work because the people that I interact with, interview with, believe in it. Now, I would argue that if you look at the Tishreen movement in 2019, you had a vast amount of young people dressing on the street who clearly don't believe in it, sacrificing their lives to try and build a state that isn't built around those sectarian categories. I'm closer to them than to the politicians that I spend a lot of time interviewing, but I need to explain why they think like that and these politicians think like that and what the result of that is. So I acknowledge my biases, as anyone who's read any of my stuff can see, but even with my biases, it still centers work I do, even this, and seeking to explain why it predominates.
Toby, thank you very, very much. Really, this has been amazing. Thank you for your time and effort. And I'm sure this book will be an incredible, incredible success.
Thank you, Joseph, for all your help, and thank you for the students for
Thank you
tolerating.
all for participating. Much appreciated. Toby, I'll talk to you later. Take care.
Okay, you take care. Thanks a lot.